everyone, and I am here in the Oval Office of the White House to be counting down the top 10 greatest U.S. presidents of all time. Now, before we get started, I want to lay down some ground rules real quick. So, most rankings like this that other people do don't count modern presidents in the list. I am counting every single president from George Washington all the way to Joe Biden are going to count for the list. Now, these people I am judging by basically everything for the presidents. I'm judging by character as well as how they did during the presidencies, or if I think they had a positive or negative impact on the country, or if there was some conflict going on at that time, if I think they handled it well or whatnot. But so yeah, pretty self-explanatory. And we're gonna be counting down from number 10 to 1. So let me know down in the comments below what presidents you think should be in the top 10 that I didn't put there, or presidents that I put that you don't think should be in the top 10. So without further ado, let's go! Number 10, John F. Kennedy. Alright, so I decided to start off this list with John F. Kennedy. Now, the main reason he's not higher on the list is because his presidency was so short. He only was in there for about 2 years before he got assassinated. But what he did in that short amount of time was absolutely amazing. First and foremost, his very influential speeches, like the Moon speech and his inaugural address, got people very fired up. As well as his dealings with the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. He put in the blockade on Cuba when the Soviet Union had a missile bases there. He definitely avoided some people don't realize how close that the United States and the Soviet Union got to a nuclear war at that moment. There's several times in American history where we got really close to nuclear warfare. That could have been the end of the world right there. And as well as his dealings with the space race. He wasn't president at the time when we got the United States to the moon, but he was the guy who really pushed for it to happen in the 1960s. But he put the naval blockade on Cuba to stop the Soviets from going to send missiles to the United States with the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. Was a very smart move on his part, give him credit for that. That was one of the greatest things that he did. But I can't put him any higher than number 10, mainly because his term was so short, because he did get assassinated in 1963 in Dallas, Texas. But what he did was amazing in those 2 years that he was president. Just a great leader, a great speaker, and just a very solid president overall. Number 9, James K. Polk. Alright guys, so I decided to put James Polk at the number 9 spot. Now, a lot of people don't really talk about James Polk too much. I do. I personally think he was one of the better presidents of that. He was probably the best president of that time period. He was president from 1845 to 1849. I've actually seen his grave. He's buried in Nashville, Tennessee, which is where he's from. But Polk was a very good president in the fact that he only served one term, and he ran on the idea that he was going to expand the U.S.'s territory. So what he did was almost all of the land outside of Louisiana, western United States, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, was he got for us with the Mexican War. That went on during his presidency. And the two major, issues of the 19th century was manifest destiny and slavery. And James Polk had more to do with those two issues than I think any other president. And he definitely handled it very well compared to most of the other presidents of that time period. A lot of the presidents in the 1840s and 50s were pretty trash, but Polk wanted to get the land out in Mexico. So what he did was he sent in troops to start shooting up the place in Mexico, and they declared war on him. The Mexican president, Santa Anna, declared war on the U.S., and then we went to war with Mexico for about 2 years, like in the 1840s, 1846 to 1848. And then we got all the land out by the Pacific Ocean. All those states were because of Polk. So if you live anywhere out in the western U.S., you can thank Polk for that. And he did that all in one term, which was crazy. Yes, he did own slaves, but at the same time, you could say that for any of the presidents of the early 1800s. Most of them did own slaves, especially with him being a Southerner. But The one thing you could say negative about him, he was a pretty aggressive expansionist, but I support imperialism, so I do think his annexation of Texas and going to war with Mexico to take the land was a very positive thing for the United States to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean by the end of his term. But, however, he did die like 3 months after he left office, so he didn't really get to see much of that. But it's cool knowing that you can go home and then looking at the U.S. map and just knowing that all of that you did on the side. So that's pretty cool. And I think Polk was a very good president for expanding the U.S.'s territory. Number 8, Harry Truman. Now, decided to put Harry Truman at number 8. Now, before we get started with this, before I talk about him, I gotta say, I used to freaking hate this guy. Now, like back in the day, I used to always think, oh, this is just the guy, he just killed millions of innocent Japanese people with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But he did a lot more for this country, especially in the early stages of the Cold War, than people realize. So he was originally vice president under Franklin Roosevelt, who died in April of 1945. He ran with him for his 4th term, but everything goes down in April of 1945. So Franklin Roosevelt dies of a cerebral hemorrhage, and then Harry Truman comes in as president after being vice president for 1 month, and then World War II. He comes in at the end of World War II, but April is the month that the war in Europe basically ends. So, but we were still fighting Japan for a few months after that. So he decides he has no other choice but to just drop 2 nuclear bombs. Now, the nuclear weapons were very new at this time. He drops 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the cities, and just devastates. He kills all of those people. And people think Harry Truman is just the most vicious person for doing that, but World War II had lasted for literally 6 years up to this point. Everyone was sick of it. He had to do something to end it, and that was just the only way he did. He could have stormed Tokyo and firebombed it, or had a flat-out invasion of Japan, but that would have ended up being way more bloody than that. A ton of Americans would have probably died if he did that, so he decided to just nuke the cities. Those 2 nuclear bombs, surprisingly, were the only 2 nuclear bombs ever dropped in world history for an attack. There have been several thousand dropped for testing, but those are the only 2 ever that were because of an attack. But right after World War II ended, he got the United States involved with the Cold War against the Soviet Union with the communist regime, and he did a good job at containing it. He passed the Truman Doctrine policy in 1947, which was all on aiding Western Europe to keep communism in the same place, because he did not want to spread it. But in 1949, the Soviet Union expands communism to Asia, with China becoming communist in 1949. So Harry Truman's like, we need to do something about this with the new domino theory aspect, which means that when one country falls to communism, they're all going to fall on. And he thought the Soviet Union was going to just try to take over the world with communism. So he sided with Western Europe, we were all democratic, and then he's like, we need to help them out. So he aided them to make sure communism would not spread. And he did all that he could to try to contain it. And especially in 1950 with the Korean War, they were trying to spread communism to North Korea. So he got us involved in that war to try to contain it. In 1950, 1953, that was a war. And a lot of people don't think that was a good idea. I can understand the reason why people don't like the Korean War, because a lot of Americans died in that war. It was actually more vicious than people really think. But now, he did also a very good job at stopping a nuclear war from happening. We got very close during the Korean War for a very devastating World War III that he stopped. There were ideas for him to send nuclear bombs to Korea during the war, but they didn't do that because that would have probably triggered the Soviet Union, and they probably would have started a World War III from there. So Harry Truman did a good job at doing that. His Truman Doctrine policy, trying to contain the communist regime, was some very good stuff, and I give Harry Truman credit for that. And my opinions have definitely changed on him in the past few months. So that's why I think Harry Truman deserves a number 8 spot. Number 7, James Madison. Now, Another president that I just recently saw their grave, James Madison, the fourth president from 1809 to 1817. Now, James Madison is actually a pretty cool guy. Besides being president, he was also the father of the Constitution. He wrote the Bill of Rights. He was very awesome, a very influential founding father. But during his presidency, the major issue was the War of 1812. And the number one thing I like about James Madison is he was the only president, as president, to lead troops in battle during the War of 1812. I forgot what the battle was called, but he did that. He actually led troops into battle as the commander-in-chief, which is freaking awesome. And also, Madison was a great founding father, very important figure to the United States, being writing the Bill of Rights. And he won, obviously, 2 terms. Was from Virginia. Yeah, I really like James Madison. His wife as well was probably my favorite first lady of all time, Dolly Madison, who popularized ice cream in the United States. And also, when the British were coming to burn down the White House, she helped grab the portrait of George Washington and a bunch of other items and helped them out, save them before they burnt down the city of Washington, D.C. But yeah, I think Madison was a very nice president. Very good indeed. Number 6. Dwight D Eisenhower. Alright guys, so before you go on a rant in the comments saying, oh my god, he picked all these mid-20th century presidents. Well, yeah, I know I did. I'm not biased towards that time period. I just think that we had a lot of good presidents that time period. We had like a string of 4 great presidents in a row between the 1940s and 50s and 60s. And Eisenhower was one of the best of that time period. Now, Eisenhower previously served in World War II as like one of the high-ranking generals. But I don't know if he actually led troops into battle. I think he was just kind of like a sit-down general or whatever, but I could be wrong on that. But anyways, he wins. He serves from 1953 to 1961. The 2 major things that he created were the Interstate Highway System Act in 1956, which I think is so freaking revolutionary, which I love Eisenhower for that. That is, you don't realize how revolutionary of an act that was to put in the interstate highway system. The way we travel on roads just completely changed forever during Eisenhower's administration. He also created NASA. And during his presidency in the 1950s is when we really got involved with the space race against the Soviet Union. Now, they did launch Sputnik in 1957, which was the first satellite to go around the Earth, but he did create the NASA program, which eventually would lead to all of this space exploration, and eventually got us on top with space travel supremacy against the Soviets. And he did do a good job at ending the Korean War as well that Truman had started previously. So that was good stuff. He got troops out of there intact during those 8 years that he was in office. And most of my grandparents were born during his administration too, so I got pretty big bias towards him. I don't know, I just really like this guy. Number 5, Thomas Jefferson. Alright guys, so another older president that I had just recently visited the grave of. We got my man Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson, one of my favorite founding fathers, one of my favorite historical figures of all time. Now, he was president from 1801 to 1809, 2-term president. His major accomplishment during president was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. He was the guy that sent out the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he completely doubled the size of the United States after they bought the Louisiana territory from Napoleon, who had been previously owned by France, but Napoleon took over in France, so he sold it to the United States for a very cheap price. So they got all of that land out there under Thomas Jefferson. He was also a very influential founding father, probably one of the most influential. He was the main guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, of course, being the freedom document against the British. The famous date was July 4th, 1776, which he was the guy who wrote most of it. He wrote it, but he didn't create all the ideas. It was also Adams and Ben Franklin and all those guys, but he wrote almost all of it. He was also a very talented politician and diplomat during the late 1700s, early 1800s. He did serve two terms. He defeated John Adams again for re-election. He was a cool thing to note about Thomas Jefferson. He was previously Secretary of State under George Washington. He was the first Secretary of State. And then under John Adams, he was the second Vice President. And then he was the third President. So he was the first Secretary of State, second Vice President, and third President. 1, 2, 3. However, his Vice President, Aaron Burr, was his first. He had two separate Vice Presidents. Aaron Burr was his first one, but he decided he got rid of him after in 1804 when he killed Alexander Hamilton. So he's like, Aaron Burr, you're out of here. So then he got George Clinton in as his next vice president. But the one negative thing that Jefferson did was the Embargo Act of 1807, where he cut off the United States' trade with foreign countries, which really hurt the economy for a little bit. But I'm not going to really hurt him for that too much. But that really pushes him for not being too high up on the list. But I do think everything else that he did was very good for this country. Number 4, Abraham Lincoln. He was president during the American Civil War, probably the most crucial hour in American history, when you had the rebellious southern states against the Union. So he did a very good job at containing the Union, and originally the idea was just to get the states back, was originally the idea in the Civil War. At the beginning of the war, stopping slavery was not the major idea. It wasn't until 1863 when he passed the Emancipation Proclamation, which was the act that freed all the slaves in the southern U.S., when people really started to fight for the slavery issue. And that's when he pulled the Union to victory during that war and hired some good commanding generals to help defeat the Confederate States. And he was also, he was in 1860, so he's kind of the reason the Civil War started, but at the same time, he ended it. So you can't really get mad at him for that. But he did suspend the habeas corpus pretty far. He basically bent the Constitution very far without outright denying it. And he's not the only guy that did stuff unconstitutional. Thomas Jefferson, for example, did a lot of unconstitutional things, like expanding the territory. That wasn't really part of in there, but he said, it doesn't say we can't do it, so we'll do it. So that's what Jefferson did, and Lincoln kind of went off the same policies. But you had to suspend, but it does say in the Constitution that you can suspend it during times of rebellion or war. So he was a very, very good president. Obviously, ending slavery was his huge achievement, and people remember him for that. And he's on a ton of currencies, probably one of the most well-known historical figures of human history. He was a great guy. Number 3, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. All right, guys, so I decided to put Franklin Roosevelt at number 3 above Abraham Lincoln. Now, this guy, another guy I used to not be too big a fan of, Franklin Roosevelt, but you cannot deny the fact that he did so much for this country to get us out. He came into office in 1933 during the middle of the Great Depression. There was 2 major conflicts going on during his presidency. So at first you had the Great Depression, and then you had World War II in 1941. So for the first 10 years, you had that. He was the only president to be elected more than twice. He won a third and fourth time, although he died a month into his 4th term. But before that, it wasn't a law. You could run however much you wanted to, just no one did, except him. Anyway, so he comes in during the Great Depression. He starts the New Deal, 54 programs to try to restore the prosperity of the United States, which I'm not a big fan of all the New Deal programs. I don't think the New Deal I'm not too big a fan of it, but I cannot deny the fact that it was kind of needed to get out of it. He also decided, we cannot, because previously the United States had been a market economy, to where all the private businesses would decide how the economy is going to be run. But Roosevelt, after the Great Depression, he's like, we need to stop with this laissez-faire stuff, and we need to change the economy to a mixed economy. To where mixed economy means that the businesses still have control over what they want to do, but the United States, the government, can step in and help promote economic stability, which was very good because he wanted to make sure that nothing like that would ever happen again. And then in 1941, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, getting us into World War II. So he declares war on Japan. Well, not he doesn't declare it. Congress declares war. But he's in there, and he gives his famous speech yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. So he did that. And surprisingly, and the thing about Roosevelt that he didn't want people to know about, he was a disabled person. He had suffered from polio early on in his presidency, or maybe even before that, and he was in a wheelchair for almost all of his presidency. But he didn't want people to know. So a lot of the pictures you see of him, he's not in there. There's only a few pictures where he actually has it because he thought people were going to think he was weak. And he basically, if it wasn't for him getting involved in World War II, Hitler probably would have taken over in Europe. The United States really helped take back the land that he had conquered in France and Africa and Italy and stuff. So he was a very good leader during both World War II and Great Depression. Two most critical hours in American history. If we wouldn't have had a good president, that our country could have gone really far downhill. Number 2, George Washington. Now, a lot of you are going to be surprised. A lot of you probably know George Washington is one of the best presidents. He was my favorite president for a while, but he's not anymore. You'll see who is my favorite. Some of you probably already know. But Washington is an amazing human being. One of my favorite historical figures, definitely top 5 favorite historical figures of all time. He is, if you're going to blame one person for the founding of the United States, it's King George III. But if you're going to blame another person, it's got to be George Washington. No one really opposed him. Before he became president, there had not been any presidents before. He was the very first one, and he set the standard, he set the bar so ridiculously high that I don't think any president but one has surpassed it.
Every president, the Constitution
didn't really make it clear what the role of the presidency was, so Washington really had to just design it all from scratch, and he did a pretty good job at keeping a balance between the federal government and the legislative branch and the executives. So he was also obviously the commanding general during the Revolutionary War and led the United States to victory. Because of that, he was basically elected unanimously for the office. Now, Washington could have easily took the presidency to full ramp and became the king of the United States, or the king of America. But he didn't do that. There was several offers to make him the king. The idea that the United States is going to be a free country with a republic. And democracy. So he's like, I don't want to be a king. But they did elect him as president twice. The first time they both ran unanimously. No one really opposed him at all. And he set the standards for all the precedents that would be set for what the presidency would become in the next few hundred years. He also, during his presidency, he signed the Neutrality Proclamation, which basically made it so that the United States wasn't going to get involved in any foreign conflicts during the 17 and 1800s. We actually didn't get involved with any foreign conflicts until World War I, when they sunk the Lusitania, when Germany sunk the Lusitania. But before that, we didn't get involved in any foreign conflicts. The only major war in the 1800s that was deadly was the Civil War, and that was against ourselves. So, we did get involved with Mexico and Spain, but that was a direct conflict. We didn't get involved in an indirect conflict until 1917. So he did a very good job at signing that Neutrality Act. It was a very good act. He was also not affiliated with any political party, which I completely support. He thought that political parties were going to split the country, but what do they do after that? They just they add political parties with Adams and Jefferson, with the Federalist and Anti-Federalist after he leaves. Just big slap in the face to him. He also put down the Whiskey Rebellion. Back in 1794, I think it was. I don't know the exact year, but it was 1790s. There was a group of rebels in Pennsylvania, and they knew the United States was built off of the excessive taxation from Great Britain, and we had a tax on whiskey. So they decided they were going to rebel. But then George Washington came out. They got word that Washington was coming out with an army, and he was leading it. And they just fled into their houses. I don't think anyone was killed. But he kind of led troops into that, and then he put it down like that. Like no one was going to mess with freaking George. And he was just an amazing person. Basically, the United States would not be in the same place that it was today if him. And the thing I love the most about him that makes him really unique, as for most people that have power and rebel and get all this new independence. A lot of generals like that, like William the Conqueror, Napoleon, or Hitler or Julius Caesar, a lot of them had rose to prominence and became like a ruling dictator or the king. Washington just was like, he could have easily just ruled the entire North America at that point, but he decided that he was just gonna let it be a democracy. That was one of the coolest parts about him, that he didn't just want to rise to the top and he just wanted to live as a private citizen after that. Just he had a great ego. Number 1, Donald Trump. No! Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe, and let me know if you guys want to see me do a top 10 worst presidents of all time, because I'd be glad to do one of those. So let me know what you think in the comments below. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. Wah!